So this notion of caste dialects and the social class is reflected in language. Now, if you are not fully aware of these nuances of language, then you may not be in a position to translate it effectively. Suppose if someone is using, and that kind of problem we saw in the translation of Khamo Ka Savera. There were expressions used for lower caste people like Sala. Now that has been translated as these fellows. Now these fellows does not capture the harshness of Sala when it is translated as these fellows. So when we come to see language differently, because language are used by different people in different ways, in different situations. A language used by a rickshawala will be somewhat different from the language used by a professor in a university campus. So what are the differences, and how, whether these differences can be captured in translation or not? That is the issue that is covered under sociolinguistic model. So it mainly talks about cross-cultural and intercultural communication, intra and intercultural communication. Intra in the sense that the same culture, the same group of people, they have different segments. They can further be segmented into smaller groups. Hindi speaking people can further be divided into smaller segments. Now they all use language differently. So their way of writing, or their way of expression, or their way of using language will be somewhat different. That will vary from person to person. Now the question arises whether they can easily be captured in translation or not. Yes, they can be, if you are fully aware of the system of the social stratification. If you are familiar with that social stratification, then only you can capture that kind of differences in your translation. Otherwise you may not be able to capture them in your translations. So in this model, texts are seen as unique products of the social structure of a particular culture, because now text is not only a product, it's a product of the social structure of a particular culture. Now what does it suggest? It simply gives you an idea that each culture has different social structures, and you should be fully familiar with that social structure if you want to capture all the nuances of that particular culture, because their contexts are unique and texts are not repeatable. An extreme version of this model leads to translation nihilism. Sometimes people believe that there are issues which cannot easily be translated. This takes us to untranslatability, to the area of, or the domain of untranslatability, where we feel that this cannot be translated. Yes, there are issues which cannot easily be translated, and while discussing Khamo Ka Savera the other day in the seminar that was conducted by Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysore, and especially Translation Mission, we could realize that there are issues which cannot easily be translated, and translation becomes almost impossible. But I still believe that if efforts are made, then you can translate the intended meaning or the intended meaning of the author. And in that way, sociolinguistic model gives you some idea about the different levels of language and how they can be translated. We were just discussing about the socio-cultural aspect of translation, and we came to the conclusion that in socio-cultural model, translation creates surface understanding on the basis of linguistic sequences that are formally correct but leave the reader unsettled. When we move from sociocultural aspect to the psycholinguistic aspect, we find that the psycholinguistic model is more concerned with describing the cognitive aspect of translation process. The psycholinguistic approach has outgrown this initial pedagogical perspective. It deals with the general cognitive structure of translation, including the specific cognitive processes that are involved while translating. The model, the psycholinguistic model, attempts to isolate the cognitive factors and language processing strategies which characterize translation. So, if we go deeper into it, what do we find? The main question that emerges out of our understanding of psycholinguistic model is that what goes on in the mind of the translator. And this is what Krings 1986 says. He says that in psycholinguistic model we are more interested in what goes on in the mind of the translator. One goal of the psycholinguistic model is to determine the cognitive substrates of observable patterns of practices. That means it tries to see the cognitive aspect, it tries to highlight the cognitive aspect, and this is how psycholinguistic model is different from all other models that we have discussed so far. In sociocultural model or sociolinguistic model, the focus was mainly on the social classes, the class dialects, and the differences that we find in the class dialects. But in psycholinguistic model, the focus is on the cognitive aspect of translation, what goes inside the mind of the translator, how it attempts to understand the role of how it attempts to understand the author and then reproduces the whole thing in his own way. Now there is always, because a lot of balancing is needed to translate correctly, and this is what a translator does. He first attempts to, he is a reader, he attempts to understand the author first, and then he moves slowly, he moves slowly to become a writer himself, and then he starts reproducing the whole thing in his own way. So there is a balancing act of balance or balancing in between the two, what author intends to say and what the translator is addressing in his own way to his audience. So this balancing or this act of balancing needs a lot of cognitive aspect, and these cognitive aspects are highlighted in psycholinguistic model. Just to elaborate this point further, we may cite a few examples to prove our point. Let's take the example that we cited earlier, and that is Mr. X is intelligent. Now if someone is reading this expression, he will come to the conclusion that Mr. X is intelligent. Now the question is, what goes into the mind of the translator? Now as a translator, we have to peep into the mind of the author, what author intends to say. So there is a lot of cognitive issues that comes in between. On the one hand, you have to peep into the mind of the author to know the intended meaning of the author, and then you slowly move to the reader, because you are trying to see whether that particular expression will be acceptable to your reader or not. So he is trying to balance between the two. Now here comes the issues of for whom you are translating. For example, if you are translating Shakespeare for a small children, now your approach will be totally different. The kind of language that you will use, the way you will express yourself, that will be somewhat different from a translation that you may do for adults. And there are a lot of translations which have been done for children, so the approach goes totally different. And this is how a mind plays a major role in this kind of translation. As a translator, he has to go through the cognitive aspect of translation process. He has to understand the mind of the reader as well as the mind of the author to understand, to bring out his own translation.